Perfect. Welcome to our September equinox edition of OPA Live. Today's exciting presentations kick off our fall lineup in our speaker series and our final Astrologer virtual conference for 2022. Sunday, September 25th, Greg Bogart will be speaking on the art of astrological relationship counseling in 6 vignettes. On Sunday, October 2nd, Omari Martin will provide an insight to the government, economics, and finances, a mundane astrology perspective. Sunday, October 16th, Sol Johansson will give us a talk on karma of planets. So go to opaastrology.org to get more details. Our final Astrologer mini conference of the year is scheduled for October 8th and 9th. The Tucson in-person conference was such a success. The presentations from the speakers were extraordinary. During the conference, we were unable to record the talks. So this mini virtual conference is the same speakers that spoke in Tucson giving their same talk. The OPA board has decided, in gratitude to all that attended our online and in-person Astrologer conference and helped to make it such a success, that these recorded talks will be added to your portal in the events website. You will be sent a program with the links to join the virtual conference for free. As with all other Astrologer talks, you will have access to them until February 2023. Anyone who did not attend Astrologer can attend this mini virtual conference by going to the OPA events website and making a purchase. The cost for this mini conference is $150. Some housekeeping. As with all OPA Lives, the speakers will first speak, and then there will be a few minutes to take Q&A. So today, because we started late, we will take Q&A at the very end of all our speakers. We ask that you keep your comments in the chat box relevant to the topics being discussed. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the talk. Now to the main event. Today's topic is evolving perspectives in relationship astrology. We have 4 exciting speakers that will be presenting. To start us off, we have Jen Zart. Jen Zart, PhD, serves the astrological community as an astrologer, writer, editor, publisher, lecturer, teacher, and newly minted director of Celestial Arts Education Library Institute in Olympia, Washington, a membership-based reference library. Visit Jen and a collection of 5,000 astrology books at the Cayley Institute, cayley.institute. I will put the website in the chat box. Jen's talk today is more than just a phase. What Mars and Venus tell us about relating. Learn an easy method for answering the age-old question, how will we get along? The synodic phases of Mars and Venus, their individual relationships to the sun in a chart, reveal a blinding, simple and startling complex picture of how an individual relates to the world and others. Putting this phase pattern together with another person's chart will give you a fast way to describe your relationship regardless of the signs. This talk is a must-add to your synastry toolkit. All right, Jen.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'm excited to kick this off. My Aries moon is quite happy to share this research with you. And I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to talk a little bit about relating. So this talk fell in my lap at a conference in the Bahamas. It was the Sky Astrology Conference that Adam Gainsberg kicked off with Julene Packer-Lewis and Gary Caton. And they were talking about the synodic phases of Mars and Venus. And in that room, we basically had a phase match experience inside 2 different best friends who were there, me and my best friend who was also at the conference, and it was Demetra George and her best friend. And we realized that the phases of Mars and Venus were matching in these horoscopes of in our charts that we were living, like we were all there at this conference together. So it kind of became like this research question for me to see in synastry, how does phase work when we're looking at charts because there was an obvious resonance with these two different sets of really close friends having a great time. So I've done some work to break this down, and if the things that I speak about in the next 20 minutes don't make sense, we still have our career astrologer. And so there's an entire article about this in there, and you can read it at your leisure later. So when I'm talking about phase, I'm actually referring to something called a synodic cycle. Two planets have a synodic cycle. Synod means coming together or conjunction. And every set of planets that you can imagine has a synodic cycle. Sometimes people talk about synodic cycles relating only to the sun, but in fact, we all are very aware of the recent synodic return of Saturn and Pluto in January of 2020. And we also had the great mutation of Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius that was the air shift, right, into air from earth signs, those conjunctions. And so we have a concept here of like any two planets can have a relationship. So today I'm going to be speaking about the synodic pattern that Venus makes with the sun and the synodic pattern that Mars makes with the sun. And I'm doing this because when we're talking about comparing people's charts together, synastry typically in the popular consciousness looks at sun sign to sun sign. Oh, a Leo and an Aquarius, what's that relationship going to be like? Oh, a Virgo and a Sagittarius, what will that relationship be like? Who am I compatible with? At the next level, people go down to the moon and they say, well, if you have an earth moon and I've got a water moon, we might have some flow. It's a sextile. But if we have, a fire moon and an earth moon, this might be a conflict because it's a square. I want to take it a step further and look at how phase with Venus and phase with Mars, both in relationship to our sun position, give us an insight into how we connect, that's Venus, and how we do our stuff, right? How we act is Mars. When we can get a picture of our general pattern of action, pattern of connection, we don't actually need a birth time. So the other amazing thing about looking at the charts from this perspective is that even if you only know potential future sweetheart's birthday, because sometimes that's listed or you've asked them what it is, you can check their phase and already see what is going to happen in terms of how you'll relate initially and over time. And I'm going to break it down a little bit in terms of the initial opposites attract. When we see Venus and Mars out of phase, that can lead to discomfort over time, regardless of most other chart factors, right? So this is an interesting way to figure out how to gauge what your issues are going to be with someone, right? And it's a pretty fast track thing. And you don't need an exact time for it unless the person happened to be born during an exact conjunction of the sun and Venus or an opposition of the sun and Mars. And we're going to get into some astronomy now. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and show you a piece of paper. So when we look at Venus, everybody always asks me, how do you tell what my phase is? Take the chart, any chart, and put the sun on the ascendant. Rotate it around until you see the sun on the ascendant here. And if Venus is above the horizon, it's a morning star. If it's below the horizon, Venus is an evening star. That's because if you go through the chart by day and rotate it around, and now the sun would be on the descendant, Venus below the horizon is visible at night, right? So you see how that works. So if you have the chart with, imagine the sun on the ascendant rising, if it's above the horizon, then it's a morning star. If it's below the horizon, it's an evening star. Now, another way of putting that would be, if Venus comes before the sun in zodiacal order, it's a morning star. And if it's after the sun in zodiacal order, it's an evening star. This October 22nd, there'll be a superior conjunction of Venus at 29 degrees of Libra, which means that right now, Venus is still a morning star, and after October 22nd, it will become an evening star. Morning star Venus. How does that Venus connect? A morning star Venus connection is described in Mesopotamian culture, the ancestors of our current astrology, with the goddess Inanna. When she was young, she was very battle ready, very excited to go out into the world and get what she wanted without thinking too much about the consequences. So people who have a morning star Venus tend to be brave. they tend to be a little more socially risky because they're not thinking about other people's pre-existing political problems. They're thinking to themselves, that's your stuff, you can keep it. I'm not interested in taking on your things. I have my own things to do, right? And so it can seem insensitive, but it's not that. It's more like saying, I have a boundary. Your social dramas are yours and mine are mine, and that's just how it's going to be. And what will happen is they'll often cause some social turbulence because it's appearing as though they're not really paying attention or listening to the pre-existing social sensitivities that are around them. And if Venus is growing in brightness, this desire to go out into the world and get what you want is increasing. That's because Venus can only be 48 degrees away from the sun in its orbit inside the Earth and the sun. So then Venus will start getting to become an evening star, right? She'll go out and get bright, maximum morning brightness, and then she'll look like she's disappearing into the sun a little bit in zodiacal order. She'll start to like pull back, right? And it's not that she's retrograde. That's not that at all. It's just that she's on the superior side of the sun, right? So if you look at it now, there will be a conjunction and Venus will be looking like it's going direct, but still conjunct. It will be getting invisible though. It is invisible currently. And this is when people are getting an inkling that maybe they should be careful when they walk into a party and start talking to two people that are having a problem with each other, right? So, oh, you know, that people might not like me doing that. Maybe I should be more discreet, okay? The people who have Venus as an evening star are more aware of the consequences of connection. And so they appear to be shyer. They appear to withhold the super exuberant, perhaps extroverted friendliness until they're ready to like invest in that social relationship. Because when Inanna went into the underworld, was invisible behind the sun, she ended up getting killed by her sister. Why? Because in her battle readiness, Inanna accidentally led to the death of her sister's husband. And so her sister's like, why are you here helping me grieve? You're the reason why I'm not married anymore. Like, yeah, I don't like you, go away. And so Inanna actually gets killed, and there's a very long story about how she gets revived again, but it's a myth. So yes, she comes back out of the underworld. Venus comes back out from behind the sun. And now Inanna knows death, and she knows the consequences of connection, and she's more careful. She's more deliberate about how she goes about her business now, and she's not ready to just go into the fray and get what she wants. And so people who have the evening star Venus, I like to say to my clients, it's as though they have this neon sign above them saying, I can handle all of your grief. I can handle all of the traumas that you've had, and you can talk to me. And oftentimes these people feel like they'll just be randomly out in public and people will come up to them saying, oh, all these horrible things happened to me. And it's like, whoa, I don't even know you. Why are you telling me this? Right? Like, that's kind of strange. And the evening star Venus people are very sensitive to pre-existing social relationships. And so there's a carefulness there. So what happens in synastry is that a morning star Venus and an evening star Venus are going to be incompatible over time, potentially, because the morning star Venus person might embarrass the evening star Venus person. Why did you burst out in the room and do that? And the evening star Venus person might be too shy for the morning star Venus person. Regardless of sign, we're talking simply about placement in relationship to the sun. And I have a few example charts when I start my slides again, but now we need to talk about Mars. So I made another drawing with a Sharpie. I don't like PowerPoint. Okay, so Mars, if we again put the sun on the ascendant, if Mars is above the horizon in that chart, then it's what is, I call an inventor Mars, right? That the opposition, when Mars is always retrograde, then it becomes what I call the service Mars, right? And I liken this to an artist. So if you're a painter, you might be a young person with a spray can and you're just tagging initials all around town. And then Mars gets to that opening square with the sun. And then you realize, oh, I can embellish these letter forms. I can make them have a little more color and pizzazz. And everybody in town's going, yeah, but you're still putting graffiti on my building. Like, I don't really want to see any of it, right? And then it goes to that opposition point. And there's this opening up of reception saying, okay, well, I am still a street artist, but let me enter into a competition and maybe paint some beautiful murals in the city that they're open for that. And they want murals now and they're asking for it. And then by the time it gets to that waning square and Mars is coming back around to conjoin the sun again and restart the cycle, this is somebody who says, what do you want me to paint? Because I want to make a beautiful painting for this community. And they get all this input. And so the things that they're painting aren't coming out of their own mind. They're saying, oh, this community wants to have the trucks that they make in the factory here and the corn that they grow in the fields here. And so I'm going to paint that, even though it's not my art. I'm an artist who is serving the group, right? So people who have this earlier phase Mars are trying to create something new, but they are doing it in a way that rubs up against the standards that have been established in society, right? And so they're wondering why they keep getting in trouble, or they get accused of not listening, or there's some kind of thing where they seem insensitive. And it's not that they're not paying attention. They're so driven by wanting to do something their own way. And the service-based Mars people, this older phase, I'm trying to avoid any moral conscription around mature, right? Like, it's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's more like, are you inventing something or are you serving something? And people who are having a service-based Mars on that sort of older part of the cycle, they can still invent new things, but their desire is to tune into what the community wants and give it to them, right? So in relationships then, the early phase Mars people tend to make messes in the process of invention, right? If you're using something for its unintended purpose, like spaghetti, you're supposed to eat spaghetti. The service-based Mars person's eating spaghetti. The early phase Mars person's throwing it against the wall, going, look at that shape. That's a cool thing. I'll put that down, right? Will it stick? I don't know. Let's try it. So they're over there playing with their food, making a mess, but they might actually come up with something really cool, you know? And so that can be a little bit irritating to the service-based Mars person who's sort of like, why are you making a mess? Just eat your food. And then the service-based Mars person is holding back the creativity of that inventor person, right? So there needs to be a sort of awareness of, hey, if there's a phase mismatch, like, oh, you're trying something out, and in order to do that, it does actually create a little bit of a collateral damage, but you might actually come up with something that's never been in existence before that people don't know how to see until they've seen it long enough to actually understand that it's real. And the service-based person needs to maybe adopt a little bit of risk, and or just understand they have a more conservative approach to the material reality, and they might be really good at doing things the right way, but who's to say what determines what's right and wrong, right? And so what will happen when people have a phase step in step goes back to that conference that we had in the Bahamas, where this became clear to me, is that it's like water. You can just be inventive together. You connect together. If you have Morningstar Venus, it's like, hey, let's just go and do the thing. And everyone's going, wow, those two are having a lot of fun. And if you have the service-based Mars, both of you might be involved in volunteering in some way together. And you're just like, oh, we're on the mission. Let's do this. Whereas the people who have the more inventive Mars are getting together saying, hey, let's make a massive creation and figure out where to go from here and not worry about what's going to happen at the end of it. So we have this kind of interesting way of relating based off of these phases. So I'm going to go back to my slides quick and show you some charts. So here we have a little bit of a definition. The synastic pattern return is when the arc distance between 2 points is replicated in one another's charts, whether or not there's a direct aspect between those factors in the chart. Meaning, if you have that pattern of Venus and the sun together by arc distance, like let's say you've got Venus 17 degrees ahead of the sun is a morning star, other people who have that Venus will resonate with you, even if those Venus and sun parts of your chart don't have synastry, right? This is a whole other way of looking at synastry that's always already relational. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is a Libra sun dating a Virgo sun. They both have the same exact Mars. This is a Mars conjunction. And look at this juicy Venus conjunction. An astrologer would predict these two people are probably going to hit it off. I've erased the rest of the chart because I'm trying to focus just on Mars and just on Venus. The Venus-Venus conjunction, however, is not a conjunction by phase. In fact, it's a very different chart because this is a morning star Venus person, and this is an evening star Venus person. You can see the sun is in Virgo, and Libra is behind the sun in zodiacal order, so that's Libra. This is a very shy individual. This is a very not shy person, right? And over time, that social relationship became uncomfortable for them. Here, though, we have a bunch of squares. Why would the synastry here work? Well, let's take a look at the math. Here we have a square between Mars and Mars. That is ripe for fighting, right? Like, these two people should not get along. And we have a square between Venus and Venus. And also the sun, right? We have this whole entire complex of squares and some of the most important synastic things that you would be looking for in trying to match people together. But look at this morning star phase and look at this morning star phase. Regardless of the squares that are here, we had two people who were very much able to work together and with such seamlessness. It was almost like water. I can't describe it any other way, but it's a really impressive thing to see when you have this kind of synastry happen, because the squares are absolutely dominated by the phase. And again, this Mars square Mars, you'd think that there would be a massive conflict that would prevent forward motion, but they actually were working together very well, right? And for many years. So this is a relationship of, quality, even though you'd say, oh my gosh, all these squares are tough. These people had something to work out together, and they did it seamlessly. They were on the same board. This is 60 degrees, so a sextile. And this is also about 60 degrees, 62 degrees, another sextile, right? So I just wanted to point that out as a way of looking to see how people can relate to each other by phase, as opposed to looking at the exact relationships between the aspects that are made between the two charts, right? And so oftentimes the value in this is not necessarily stopping with appreciating the people who have a phase match, but it's with learning how to understand the other phases, so that when you are encountering people who don't have a phase match with you, you can bring them into the picture in a way that includes their ability to do it differently than you, and not be so rigid or expecting people to be like you, right? Like I found a lot of people benefit from understanding that their partner has a different phase Mars than them, because they're saying, why are they making such a mess? And it's like, well, they're trying something out and they need your help to give space for that creativity. And the other person's saying, why is my partner not allowing me to be creative? Or why are they always telling me how to do things? I don't want to know how it's done. I want to do it another way. And like, they're always following the rules. They never try anything crazy. And it's because, the Mars that it is in the later phase does want a certain measure of efficiency, because they realize people have done this before. Why do we need to reinvent the wheel? That's not a focus for them. So when you understand those foci are different, it helps you understand where people are coming from and appreciate them for what they're bringing to the table. So yeah, I'm going to hand it over to the next speaker. Thank you for hearing me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jen, so much. That's great talk. Lots of really good information. So we're going to move along because we are a little bit late. Our next speaker is Amanda Moreno. And Amanda has been practicing astrologer and has been a soul worker for more than a decade. She is a core instructor at Portland School of Astrology and serves on the board of the International Association for Ethics in Astrology. Her master's degree is in-depth psychology focused on apocalyptic imagery effects, how apocalyptic imagery affects the psyche, and how astrology can be used to deal with the grief that arises. Amanda is known for her grounded approach to practical woo and is particularly passionate about experiential, evolutionary, and archetypical astrologies. Her website is aquarianspirals.com. I will put all these websites in the chat at the end. Amanda's topic is queering relationship astrology. Amanda will discuss best practices when it comes to navigating sessions with folks who practice non-traditional relationship styles in order to make readings more inclusive. She will cover basic definitions for relationship styles, ways to approach a chart without centering monogamy, and a few chart examples. So go ahead, Amanda.
Thanks, Jeannie, and thanks, OPA, for having me. Share screen. Okay. So I am here to talk with you essentially about honoring relationship diversity in astrology. And so that is kind of the multitude of different ways that people relate to each other. And we could talk about a lot of different versions of that. And for this, I'm going to be focusing on non-monogamous relationship styles. And so I want to do just a little bit of an introduction to myself by way of what makes me want to talk about this and how am I qualified to talk about this. So the identities that I have that are relevant to this conversation are that I am queer and I have never had a monogamous relationship in my life. I have had many committed long-term relationships, but none of them have existed within the bounds of sexual and romantic exclusivity. And so I'm also someone for whom deep platonic relationships are a priority in my life. And so they are kind of like up at the level as my romantic relationships. A large percentage of my clients are queer and participate in non-monogamous relationships, or just in some way don't prioritize or center having a monogamous relationship. I practice tropical astrology, mostly centered in modern psychological astrology. And I like to use a lot of embodiment practices to help folks get to the heart of what astrological symbolism is, how it's living and breathing through them. And I'm going to give you some examples of that in just a little bit. I am also a queerer of astrology. And, I'm bringing that in because we typically think of queer as relating to a person's gender or sexual orientation, and that's totally relevant here. But it's also making room for the ways that people exist that are outside of conventional norms, right? And so I'm thinking of queering astrology really broadly, right? So queering as an academic method that deconstructs structures of knowledge by identifying biases that are being presented as normal or inherent or ultimately desirable. And so my job as a queerer is to look at what's going on with biases in astrology and then how to reframe them so that I can bring what's being presented as outside the circle or as, outside the norm back into the circle so that astrology can be empowering to folks regardless of their identities. And so it's important to also note that I am somewhat conflating terms here, and not all queer folks practice non-monogamous relationships, and not all folks who practice non-monogamous relationships are queer. In my communities, at least, there just tends to be a lot of overlap. So we're going to go over some kind of like basic definitions of non-traditional relationship styles, and I'm just going to kind of like pepper some really basic examples throughout. So this is less about technique and more about ethics and best practices, kind of a primer, if you will. And I think it's just also important to note that in addition to, potentially bringing this information into consultation work, there's also so much room for growth in the astrological world in terms of, articles, books, social media posts about relationship astrology that include these kinds of perspectives. And so another thing that I want to say is, there's kind of a crucial point that I want to center here and that I think is really important. And so if we think of monogamy as the state of having one sexual and romantic partner at a time, it's important to note that not everyone has or wants a long-term monogamous relationship, and that's okay, right? That doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them. And whether or not it's just not a priority in general, or whether they're going through a phase in their life where it's not a priority or whatever, not everyone wants long-term monogamous relationships. So, I know that we all know that one of the most common reasons somebody seeks out a reading is because they want help with relationship stuff, right? So that's very common. But this is about kind of taking away the assumption that it's a given, right? And so like recent studies that have been done show that about 1/5 of people in the United States have experienced or participated in some kind of non-monogamous relationship at some point in their life. And then about 5% of people currently do. And we can assume that those are significant undercounts for a lot of reasons. And so there's not a lot of room for this kind of deviation from the norm in huge swaths of society, right? There can be lots of judgment around it. And so the ways that society, at least the one that I'm a part of, is set up is kind of reifying this idea that the mark of a mature human being or a happy human being or an accomplished human being is defined at least in part by their ability to kind of exist within a monogamous pair bond or be reaching towards it, right? It's a thing to desire. And more than that, many times folks are pathologized for not existing in or wanting that kind of relationship, right? There must be something wrong with them, or you're nobody till somebody loves you, right? That gets really romanticized in really problematic ways. And so I also want to just note that I am not at all saying that monogamy is not a valid choice or option. It absolutely is. It is a great choice for many folks. Right now, we're just exploring the fact that it isn't inherent, and that it is just that, it's a choice. It's one among many, right? So totally okay to want it, but also okay to not. It all depends on the context. And so another kind of subsidiary point is just that a lot of times folks will conflate monogamy and commitment, and they're actually not synonymous, right? Commitment can exist outside the realms of sexual exclusivity. Just like we can hear like some astrologers saying that Capricorn is about commitment, or some astrologers saying that Scorpio is about commitment. They're really just describing different forms of commitment, right? And so non-monogamy might not mean I will only have sex with you, but it might mean, you know, I'm committed to checking in with you before I make big life decisions, or I'm committed to our safer sex practices, or you're my in case of emergency person, right? We're just trying to like think outside the box here. All right. So the following is a basic and absolutely not exhaustive list of some terms that you might come across or that you might have heard already. With the key point being, best practice number one, just always ask your clients questions about what something means for them. So if they use one of these terms or something else, even if you think you know what it means, ask how they use it. So consensual non-monogamy is kind of an umbrella term that covers most of the definitions we're going to talk about. And the use of consensual is really important to a lot of folks because it makes clear that all parties involved are aware of what's going on. And just put more explicitly, it's saying that this is not about cheating, and this is not about infidelity or secrecy. Polyamory is a relationship in which folks maintain multiple romantic and or sexual relationships or many loves. And so this relationship style does tend to prioritize romantic and sexual connections. We could say like over platonic ones. Solo polyamory is a relationship style in which an individual prioritizes their relationship with themselves, often explicitly avoiding traditional relationship milestones, right? So like living together, marriage, combining finances, raising kids, although not always. And so it's helpful to note here that solo poly does not equal single, right? So solo poly folks can have multiple relationships, just like these other styles that we're talking about. There's just more of a focus on individual autonomy in some kind of way. And I was looking through charts the other day for another project that I'm working on and saw two very similar client charts. So both of them had Sun conjunct Venus in Libra right on the ascendant. And at the time that they came to see me, Pluto was squaring that conjunction from the 4th house cusp, and Uranus was opposing it from the descendant, right? And so one of these people was leaning into solo polyamory because they were going through a divorce and they felt like they had been kind of like surrendering their identity and who they were for their whole life. And so solo polyamory for them was kind of a rebellion against monogamy and gave them a language for maintaining the boundaries that they felt that they needed to maintain. Whereas the other person had also just recently come across the term solo polyamory, and they had never been in a monogamous relationship in their life. And they were really excited to have finally found a term and language to describe a lot of what they had been through, as well as a community that they could talk to about it. Right? It's kind of just matched up with how they'd always wanted to do relationship. So just different expressions of similar symbolism. Relationship anarchy involves a decision to engage each relationship on its own terms. So there's a lot of negotiating about structure and agreements for relationships based on what works well for the people involved. A lot of relationship anarchists are explicitly invested in questioning norms and shoulds around relationships. And so, with RA and many forms of non-monogamy, although this isn't the case across the board, folks are focused on actively digging into jealousy, possessiveness, envy, and attachment styles in order to work through them and understand more about them, rather than kind of like creating barriers and containers where they just won't have to experience that kind of thing. RA also rejects the idea that there should be an inherent hierarchy in relationship, with romantic relationships being placed at the top. And then we have non-hierarchical relationships, which is kind of what I was just talking about. And they're relationships in which agreements and structure are also negotiated. And again, it's not prioritizing sexual and romantic dynamics. And I think that one of the most commonly overlooked facets of consensual non-monogamy is that it also provides frameworks for folks who don't prioritize those sexual and romantic relationships. For example, if somebody's been in a long-term relationship and then they have some kind of health crisis happen and they can no longer be sexually active, or they don't want to, but they want to maintain the commitment, right? It's a good relationship. This is a way of making sure that all the partners in a dynamic can get their needs met. But it also includes folks who are asexual, for example, and don't necessarily experience sexual attraction, but can very much want lifelong relationship or emotional intimacy, or to raise children, or other things that we predominantly associate as being things that exist just within the bounds of a monogamous bond. So, best practice number one, don't make assumptions, ask questions. I've already said that. And that includes, making assumptions about a person being heterosexual based on what they look like, right? Or making assumptions about how a person is going to engage in relationship based on their sexuality or gender. And if I've already said this, but if somebody tells you that they're polyamorous, don't just say like, oh, well, I heard Amanda explain what that means. Like, ask them what that means to them. That also helps with using client-centered language. This also includes assumptions about a person based on their chart, right? Just like you can't look at a chart and know a person's race or gender or political affiliation. You really can't know until you talk to a person what kind of relationships they're going to be invested in. So be open to surprises in the symbolism. And we definitely have a lot of stereotypes, right? So like, as you'll see in the article that I wrote for the Career Astrologer, a common one is something like a person with strong Taurus comes in and the astrologer's like, oh, you will be too possessive, right? You'll be terrible sharing your partner. And I mean, maybe, but why confine the symbolism in that way, right? I've had Taurian clients who really struggle with possessiveness and who do want to build their relationships in ways to kind of like protect them from that, and that's okay. But I've also had Taurian clients and Scorpio clients who are really aware that they're bringing a lot of possessiveness and jealousy to the table, and they're wanting to use astrology as a way to work through and with that. So best practice number two, be aware of your own biases and value judgments, right? And this is where we get a lot of projection. Like, I've had a lot of clients come in saying that they've met with astrologers or therapists and told them that they are non-monogamous, and they can see the visible reaction on the astrologer's face. And then the astrologer says something like, I could never do that, or just make some other kind of side comment, right? So it's important to remember that, astrology, as it has been transmitted to us in the tropical tradition, is really infused with Greco-Roman notions about identity and belonging and worth and value, and what a desirable body looks like and what to desire in terms of relationship. And some of those ideas can be really oppressive. And so, they have become really insidious in our society. And so how much of what the ancient Greeks believed about gender and sexuality and marriage is still relevant today, right? And is that relevance universal? Should it be proposed as such? And so why do we keep taking these ideals and like placing them on human bodies as if we were all the same? I had a client come in once, the chart is here, and she had been studying astrology and wasn't really identifying with what she read. And she was particularly interested in her Sun Pluto conjunction in Libra and her Venus Mercury in Scorpio. And she was experiencing Uranus opposing her Venus at that point in time. And so we did some somatic work, and I had her just kind of imagine standing in her chart, right? Like making her chart into like a 3D holograph and standing in the energy of her Venus. And as she did that, she was like really compelled to look over to the left and see the sun, right? See her Libra sun there. And she said, everyone's always told me to look nice and be nice and play nice and be pretty and do the right thing. And I've tried that my whole life, but I don't want that anymore. I've been nice and diplomatic and tried to see all sides, and people still walk all over me. I want to be honest and bold and direct. And I only want relationships where my partners love that about me, so I don't have to hide it anymore. All right, and then best practice number 3. Meet your clients where they're at, right? I've already said use client-centered language, but it's also this recognition of, you know, knowing that you don't know everything, right? Relationships are hard, no matter the orientation. And to me, this is more about, you know, the ways that we're never really taught relationship and communication skills than anything that is inherently problematic about a given relationship style. Although they all have their challenges, right? And so my last example is a client who came in with Venus in Pisces, squaring Neptune and a moon in Capricorn. So Venus in Pisces squaring Neptune, comma, and then they also had a moon in Capricorn. And they tended to have very, very difficult boundaries, a difficult time with boundaries, right? Like they tended to get overwhelmed by people's energy very easily. And they were a relationship anarchist and had multiple lovers in their life, all who were really important to them and who they adored quite a bit. And it became really clear to me in our work together that their relationships were very destabilizing to them. And I wasn't sure whether or not multiple partners would work for them long term, although I kind of kept that observation to myself. And we worked together for an extended period of time. And as transiting Neptune came up to their Venus, they started gravitating towards learning about their Capricorn moon. And they became really invested in this idea of feeding their moon, right? And they ultimately discovered, you know, through a daily practice of just like tuning into their emotional needs, a love of energetic hygiene practices and boundaries. And at the end of our time together, they had decided to take a break from relationships altogether so that they could kind of center within themselves and get to know themselves and then make decisions about what they needed moving forward based on that, right? And so my last kind of point here is that it's always okay to refer out. If, you know, you really just can't get behind non-monogamous relationship styles, or you have an issue with somebody's identity in general, you know, it's really difficult for you to form a safe space for that person. And so it's always appropriate to refer out. And then kind of similarly speaking, you don't have to be an expert on non-monogamy to be supportive of a person. And so hopefully some of these ideas help you to do that. And that is all from me.
Thank you. You know, Amanda, I always learn a lot from you. I come from an older generation. I'm in my 70s. So all of these new terminologies that I have zero understanding of, what do they really mean? And I can put things together myself in my head, but just as you said, you need to ask the person exactly what it means to them, because those words might have different meanings. So thank you so very much.
Thanks for saying that, Jeannie. I
No.
appreciate you always.
Yeah, I appreciate your knowledge in this, because I'm not on the board, but I'm the admin for the IAEA, and Amanda comes in with some incredible thoughts and teachings to all of us. So thank you, Amanda. All right, I'm going to unpin Amanda, and we're coming up to Armand. So Armand Diaz is next. He is a professional astrologer based in Long Island, New York. He is the author, producer of 3 books, and frequently speaks on astrology. His website I've already put in the chat. Armand is speaking on relationship and spirituality, good times or hard work. We tend to enter into relationships with expectations of fulfillment in romantic, emotional, sexual, and other domains of life. The consideration of spiritual fulfillment through partnership is rarely primary and often doesn't register at all. In this talk, we'll consider the realistic interaction of relationship and spirituality, with an emphasis on understanding the dynamics of our connections as a means of personal growth. Go ahead, Armand. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for the introduction. And let's see over here. I have to share my screen. It's all going to go really, really well. Screen, share, and then play. Everything working okay, Jenny, as far as that goes?
Certainly is.
Okay,
Yes,
great.
it is.
Well, I have to say, OPA came to me with this topic, and this is exactly as it was written. Do you want to talk about opportunities for spiritual growth or just good times in relationship? And I have taken enough multiple choice tests to think, well, there must be a none of the above option someplace around here, because I thought, well, we don't usually think about relationships in terms of spiritual growth. It's not usually when you're getting into a relationship of any kind, you're not necessarily thinking about it in that way. As for relationships just being about good times, yeah, not, you know, if you think that the relationship's about just about having good times, you probably haven't had one, and you know, go out and have a relationship or two and come back and tell us what you think. There's good times to be had, but they're not just about good times. My skepticism about relationships for spiritual growth had to be a little bit tempered as I was thinking about it, because after all, they are part of life. Relationships are part of life. And so in that sense, we can look at them as vehicles for spiritual growth. As Ram Dass said, everything is grist for the mill of awakening. And relationships are certainly as gristly as anything else. So why not? Why not use relationships as a vehicle for spiritual growth? And the answer is yes, you can, but the odds are good that you're going to really screw it up or have a really tough time of it. And that's because relationships are difficult. Now, you know, Amanda made really wonderful points, and I made a little bit more of this in the article. Can't really go into it here, but relationship itself as a term that we think about, you know, to be in a relationship, to have the form of the relationship, to think about different types of relationships and so on. This is a very, very new innovation. I would put it as Pluto in Libra, as a sort of the shorthand for the times. The people thinking about relationships as such is a really very new kind of thing. But of course, people have been relating and the dynamic has been there for a long time. It's the ability to step back and think about, well, what type of relationship do I want to have? What is the form going to be? That's new, right? The falling in love and then being with someone, or falling in love and then not being with someone, and all the other things that they've always happened. But now relationship itself as a thing is new. And so we can kind of look at this within that light and say, okay, this is relationships themselves, as we're talking about them today, is an ongoing and rather recent project. Now, going to the third term in the equation, what does spirit mean? And that requires a little bit of talk too, because people have very different ideas about spirit. In the New Age community, if you use the term spirit or spiritual, very frequently the reference is actually to departed people, talking to the deceased, for example, with mediumship and something like that. That's a valid term for, that's valid use of the term spirit. Our word ghost, the English word ghost, is related to the German word Geist, which would translate similarly as ghost or spirit, as in like zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. So, and to talk about the departed spirits and so on. So it can mean that, and there are many different variations on the word spirit. We have to think about exactly what we mean. And then we have to think about what is spiritual growth. What does it mean to grow spiritually? So for our purposes, to talk about spirit, we're talking about that which is both the basis and the pinnacle of reality. What is it that is the basis of everything, and what is it that is the ultimate? And more or less, it's the same thing, depending upon whether you see it as being that which started everything or that which you're aiming towards. You probably hear my dog screaming in the background. I sort of apologize for that, although what can I do? Everybody in this sense has something that is their spiritual quest. It could be quite materialistic, so the basis might be something along the lines of money makes the world go round, and then the pinnacle, the ultimate at the top, would be something along the lines of whoever dies with the most toys wins. It's fairly impoverished type of spirituality, but nonetheless, that's what is the basis, and that's what the pinnacle is. All of that kind of works. Usually we would be trying to think about something a little bit wider, because the OPA audience would probably be having a little bit broader view of things and think about, it could be God or spirit or something like that. But it is the ultimate. It is the ultimate. It is both the pinnacle and the basis of reality. So what is spiritual growth? It is the movement from identification with ego. Alan Watts used to call the skin encapsulated ego, the sense of me in here and everything else out there, and moving towards greater identification, moving from just me to larger and larger sets of being. And that there's a lot of different flavors of it. There's a lot of different ways that the end term is looked upon. There are a lot of different experiences in terms of like mystical experiences and awakening experiences and so on. There are different varieties of them, and we could sort of arrange them hierarchically, or we could arrange them side by side, but it could be from the identification with self to all of humanity. A very frequent one that's talked about is like all of nature, or the entire cosmos, or a sense of identity with God. At this point in time, it's often called the Godhead when it's in that context, or spirit itself. It's this movement in stages, and probably not snapping from ego to spirit all at once, but the movement towards greater inclusivity, greater sense of identification. And so what's the strategy? Importantly, I think the spiritual traditions all agree, maintaining awareness is the key, the key tool in spiritual growth. You have to be aware of what is happening. If you think about it in terms of the negative, when you're unaware, when you're simply reactive, when there's this kind of, someone says something and you respond in a kind of automatic way, somebody pushes your buttons. Well, can you have a little space between the time that the button gets pushed and that you react? Can you at least be aware that that's what's happening? It's hard to stop. It takes a lot of practice to stop, but can you at least be aware that the button is getting pushed, that this is something that is engaging you and you're likely to be reacting? An expansion of compassion is part of the process of spiritual growth. And that makes a ton of sense, because as your sense of identity expands, naturally, you're not really looking at so much in the way of others, right? Because we're not really separate. So as you become more inclusive, as your sense of self grows, it's easier to be compassionate. It's natural. It's not even easy. It's natural to be compassionate, because you don't really see much in the way of a difference between self and other, right? It's all really part of the same thing. You're not looking at someone else out there and sort of having sympathy for them or something like that. It's like, no, this is really all the same thing. And, that's what's going on in that part over there. And this is what's going on in this part over here, but it's really all the same. And then if you're going to transcend ego, if you're going to identify with something greater, you have to be in the process of letting go of ego. And here's where we're likely to run into some problems. Here's where we're likely to have issues when it comes to our relationships. I would point out that most spiritual traditions, Eastern and Western, have proscribed relationships for serious spiritual adepts, because they are kind of difficult. They're kind of difficult to work with. It doesn't mean that it's impossible. It certainly doesn't mean that they were right about that. It doesn't mean that we have to follow through because that's what they've been doing for 1,000 years or anything. And because we have a new idea about relationships, because we're able to talk about them as objects, it should be a little easier potentially, but there's still going to be some sticking points. So what are the barriers in astrological terms when it comes to relationships? What are some of the barriers that we are likely to see? And I put them in order of the reverse order of difficulty to work with. Okay, so Venus, the Sun, Mars, and the Moon are at least a good starting set for thinking about spirit and relationships and where things can be challenging. Venus is fairly easy to work with because it is more idealistic and more or less conscious, right? So it's the idea of what we would want in partnership, what we would want in a partner, and to a large extent, what we want ourselves to be in partnership. Now, Venus by sign is probably the best way to look at this. And obviously that sort of puts out a simple little 12 archetype situation. We look at it in aspect and stuff like that. But with Venus, we're looking to see what it is we want. Now, the easy part of Venus is being able to think about, well, what are the true needs there? What are the true needs? If Venus is in Aries, for example, well, what does that mean in terms of what you want in a partner? What does that mean in terms of who you want to be in a relationship? What is it that you want relationship to look like? Where we tend to run into trouble here, though, is that we have experiences in life looking at, maybe it's our parents' relationships, and we say, oh, I want a relationship like that, or I don't want a relationship like that. Or we look at some other relationship that, someone in the community, someone on television, and we say, oh, that's really great. I want something like that. And we can sort of start to fill in the outlines with specific desires, specific ideas about the way things should be, specific ideas about how we want things to go. And that can be problematic because there are probably other ways to meet the core Venusian needs without being so specific, without following our models. So Venus, you can kind of bring attention to it with relative ease, but that's what I see as being the problem. Is, oh yeah, you want this particular type of relationship. You want to look just like this, rather than abstracting what it is that you really need. The sun, there's always a big discussion about the sun. At a deeper level, the sun is what you're about. It's the overall principle for life. But at another level, it's the things in your life that you identify with that resonate with that deeper level, right? So, this is stereotypical and untrue, but just for the sake of a talk over here, maybe when you're in one of those terrible circles where you have to go around and say something about yourself, maybe the Capricorn sun might lead off with what they do, what their career is or something like that, and maybe the Cancer sun would be, well, I'm a proud father of 3 kids or something along those lines. Not really, but you get the idea. Relationship, then, as it relates to our sense of self, is a solar issue, right? This relationship is part of me, or I want a relationship that reflects my sense of self. I find in breakups, the sun can be a little bit of an issue, because this is where you get folks who are saying, I've identified with my relationship, and now my relationship is gone. Like, I've lost a big part of myself. That's what's where I've lost part of myself. I've lost that part of me that resonated with something deeper inside, and now it's gone. Could be brought to awareness fairly easily. Yeah, maybe. that depends a lot upon who you're talking to and what you're talking about. Mars, on the other hand, we're starting to get into a much more primal kind of energy. How you do things, how you, again, it's a sense of action. And Mars, you can tell from the glyph, if nothing else, it's an arrow. Mars is directional. Mars wants to move. So it's not necessarily all that inclined to stop back and reflect. And of course, we're talking about people, we're not talking about the planets, but it's a little harder to reflect on Mars because Mars is directional, sort of wants what it wants. In modern astrology, we often tease apart Venus and Mars so that Venus is the relating part, more the love part of the process, and Mars is a little bit more the sexuality and the drive in terms of sex. That is a really new innovation. There are, old astrology traditional astrology would note that in Mars, in some placements, there might be like an overactive sex drive or something like that. But that's different than saying that Mars rules sexuality, and so or the way that you interact when you're having a argument with your partner, which is another Mars type of thing. But Mars is harder to make conscious, and then comes the moon. And the moon is deep personal and pre-personal history. We can go back way far in this. We can go back to family. We could probably go back to past lives. We can certainly go back to pre-verbal experiences in the womb, pre-verbal experiences as an infant. And here's where we're trying to either get what we didn't get early on, or we're trying to recreate what we had earlier on. And this often gets projected out into partnerships. This often becomes an issue in partnerships as we try to get from the partner what we did or what we did not get from parents or caregivers, or even in some sense, some deeper kinds of issues. Very challenging to make this type of thing conscious. So quickly, what are some strategies? You have to go into any relationship with a mindfulness of your expectations before things start stewing. Before you get into a situation, you have to have a degree of mindfulness. And then you have to maintain mindfulness when things start stewing. Now, it's a little hard to maintain mindfulness beforehand because you're probably going to be in sort of a this is all working out fine kind of mood. You're not thinking about any of the things that I've just talked about. We're just having a nice time. Everything is okay. When things start really stewing, when you start having issues, let's say that jealousy comes up or something like that, you have to be able to, on the one hand, you're going to feel jealous, or you're going to feel angry, you're going to feel, sometimes just real strong sexual desire, any one of the many infinite number of things that you can experience. You have to be able to step aside and watch that happening and say, oh, look at me, I'm really jealous, or I'm really desirous. And you have to be able to at least put enough space between that you're not functioning on autopilot. And it's a challenge. It's particularly a challenge when it comes to lunar and martial issues, but it's a bit of a challenge when it comes to solar and Venusian issues. And I believe I've hit 20 minutes just now. Yes? Jen?
If you can wrap it up if you'd like.
Well, that was kind of what I wanted to say. I don't want to, I could, what time frame would I have? It was the little story I was going to tell.
Another 5 minutes.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. Well, then, having sort of rushed through things, I was gonna make a point. Plato, in his great thing on love, the Phaedrus, he talks about the strong desire nature and how it is really such a wonderful thing. And his idea here is that you're going to see in a partner, you're going to see in the beloved something that is so wonderful, and you're going to be possessed by the divine madness. Is one of the forms of divine madness. Divination is another. So if you're in astrology, you've got 2 or 4 divine madnesses going on. That's pretty good. Anyways, what Plato says, though, is, but then you start to realize that it's not exactly this person. What you're seeing in the person is the good. You're seeing, as an abstraction, as an ultimate, as a transcendent thing. You're seeing the good. You're seeing the beautiful. And so you take yourself away from the person themselves and realize, oh, this person is showing me something that is transcendent to the personal. This is an example of something that is much greater than either of us. That's an interesting take on things. The idea that you can do that you can say, oh, wow, essentially we would, in 20th century or 21st century language, I say really 20th century language, we would say, well, I'm projecting onto this person. I'm taking something that I see that exists within me and something that exists by itself, and I'm projecting it onto the other. And then it helps you to move into a transcendental kind of, you transcend the personal relationship because you see it as being something greater. That's an interesting take on things. You'll notice, though, that Plato was not talking about relationships. He was talking about being in love. He was talking about that excitement. He was talking about that, taking the martial drive and all those things and making it work for you. It's different from the kind of, could you stop at Dairy Barn and get some milk on the way home type of things before relationship. Anyways, I did talk about relationships a lot more within the OPA Career Astrologer article, including the fact that our very idea about relationships is constructed. It varies quite a bit according to culture and society, and it is an ongoing work in progress. It's not like we should ever feel that there are just relationships. We are in the process of creating the entire thing. And there I will stop and turn it back over.
Thank you so much, Armand. Always insightful. Our
Thank you.
last speaker is going to be Rachel Lang. And Rachel is a professional astrologer, psychic medium, and author of Modern Day Magic: 8 Simple Rules to Realize Your Power and Shape Your Life. Rachel launched her business in 2006 and has since worked with a variety of clients, individuals, and businesses. She earned her master's degree in theology from Loyola Marymount University with an emphasis on ethics and feminine theology. As a writer, she contributes articles and horoscopes to Omega Institute, Conscious Living Magazine, Well and Good, and Women's Health. Rachel is a member of the Relationships and Astrology faculty, the Outreach Director for the National Council for Geocosmic Research, NCGR, and the Vice President of the Los Angeles NCGR chapter. She's very active in social justice and environmental movements. Her website and contact is in the chat box. Rachel is presenting Asteroids in Relationship Astrology. As our collective relationship and gender constructs change, we benefit from working with an expanded set of archetypes in our exploration of synastry and composite charts. By including the goddess asteroids, we can see relationship complexities beyond Venus and Mars. Exploring asteroids in composite charts can reveal nuances about a relationship. This talk provides a foundation for understanding the benefit of including asteroids in relationship charts, as well as ways to delineate asteroids in composite charts. It's all yours, Rachel.
Great, thank you so much. And I have loved listening to everyone else. So my mind is full of all the things I just heard. So I'm going to try to tie it together with asteroids. And let's see here. I'm going to share my screen. All right, there we go. So we're going to talk about asteroids. You know, we live in a time right now, as you heard from Amanda, as Armand and Jen were talking about, but really Amanda really addressed this, that we're looking at relationships in a whole new way right now. We're not looking at like limiting ourselves to heteronormative relationship constructs. We're even rethinking the way that we experience gender in our relationships. And so we're really in a transition stage culturally with how we experience sexuality, gender, relationships, family systems, family structures, all of those things. And so, you know, so we really do, I'm making a case for using asteroids, working with asteroids when we do our relationship work, because asteroids really give us more of an archetypal language to work with, more reference points for different nuances that appear for us in relationships and that play out in our lives. When we work with asteroids, we gain access to all of this symbolism. And we also can see layers of attraction beyond Venus and Mars. Because sometimes Venus and Mars just understand why we have this like spark. And, you know, it's like when we look at work in different asteroids, we can see little nuances of attraction that I think are really fascinating. Since the late 17th and early 18th century, the discovery of asteroids, asteroids were discovered right around that time, and there were, this coincided with big movements in gender, sexuality, and equality. And so we can't really study the movements of what's happening for us culturally and how we're experiencing our relationships, our gender, all of those things without looking at the asteroids. The first asteroid, Ceres, actually it's a little dwarf planet, big dwarf planet, but Ceres was discovered in 1801. And this was during the suffragette movement. This was right about 9 or 10 years after a vindication of the rights of women came out. And by 1848, there were 10 asteroids discovered, and this was really the onset of first wave feminism. And then significant discoveries with asteroids coincided with milestones in gender equality. And you can trace this back, and I do cite some of these examples in the article that you'll see in the Career Astrologer. I love the way that Demetra George and George Block explain the asteroids. And you know, in this book, in the book Asteroid Goddesses: The Mythology, Psychology, and Astrology of the Reemerging Feminine, which is an excellent resource for asteroids, and it's a really in-depth exploration of, in particular, the goddess asteroids Vesta, Juno, Ceres, and Pallas. But they say that asteroids serve as active agents in the transformational process of individuals, and specifically, they're looking at the where the asteroids are located between Mars and Jupiter. So, really bridging those social planets and the personal planets. And so the asteroids, I personally find that in relationships, the asteroids relate to unconscious beliefs and ideals that are working within us that provide some scaffolding for our relationship constructs. In any relationships, but especially those romantic ones, those influences are the root of many of our conflicts and many of the triggers that turn us on. So I look at asteroids as being aspects of our relationships that are intimate, but that may become visible to others. And when I show some chart examples, you'll see what I mean. I also see asteroids as how we've integrated or rejected cultural relationship norms individually or as a couple if you're working with synastry charts. Composite charts. I also think asteroids really relate to how the couple contributes to society. And also how the couple balances their public and private lives. And there's also, the asteroids reflect the unspoken expectations and rules that are based on cultural norms and family of origins. There are 10,000, I think, asteroids, so many, so many. And if you have ever gone down the rabbit hole of, buying the asteroid add-on addition to SolarFire and seeing all of the, you can spend hours and hours of late night, time drinking coffee, going down the asteroid rabbit hole. And I've kind of like, I'm helping you out a little bit. So I do recommend doing that because it's fascinating what you find. There are all of these little connections that you can see in different charts with different asteroids of different locations, different city names, different countries, with different animals. It's sometimes surprising and sometimes poetic, just the way that astrology works and the way that we can see these connections, even if we don't know them, even if they're not a part of our everyday practice, they're still at play. So the ones that I like to look at in relationships are Ceres, Juno, Vesta, Pallas, Eros, Amor, Cupido, Sappho, and Psyche as well. I didn't put that here, but I do also I look to see what that one's doing. I explain this in the article that I wrote, that when you first start deepening your exploration of asteroids and you start working with them, it can feel a little overwhelming because there are so many. And for those of us with Gemini moons, we want to do it all. So I'll give you sort of a little formula that I work with. First of all, when I see the bigger asteroids, I use a 5-degree orb for working with aspects, with asteroids and other planets, asteroids with one another. And then for the lesser known asteroids, or the smaller ones, so Sappho, Eris, Amor, Cupido, I tend to use a 4-degree orb, but I pay really, really close attention to any asteroids with aspects of 1 degree or asteroids in angular houses. And in relationships, especially if those asteroids are in conjunction with or opposition to Mars, Venus, the Sun, and Moon. And when I work with transits to asteroids, I'm looking for those exact transits. So that, 1 degree orb. And so that's one of the guides, just to kind of put it into some context for you. Also, you'll find that as you're working with asteroids, there are some that really resonate with you more, and some that you want to track and follow. And so don't feel like you have to incorporate all of them. You can use the ones that you like the best. I'm going to outline just a few of these. I'm going to outline the goddess asteroids, the 4 main goddess asteroids. So we'll start with Ceres. And Ceres is the goddess of agriculture and fertility and motherhood. And so in Ceres placements, and especially if they're well aspected in synastry and composite charts, we see themes of compatibility in the way that the couple expresses nurturing, shared family values. There's usually a welcoming of children or fertility. There's also an ability to establish a secure home life. I find that one of the key words for Ceres is nurturing. How can a couple receive nurturing? How do they give nurturing? And so that is one of the big themes when we're working with Ceres. And then also unconditional love tends to be a theme in these relationships too. We can also see the flip side of that coin, which is differing viewpoints about parenting, different styles. I have also noticed that there can be custody challenges in separation or divorce, particularly when Ceres is afflicted by oppositions, or in composite or in synastry. There can be a feeling of criticism and judgment. There can be difficulty with in-laws. And this is also something that I've noticed that's really interesting, that food complexes show up in relationships. And you might not think about that as like something to prioritize or something to draw attention to. But when you're talking about having a family, living together, sharing food is one of the things we do in relationships. And so we can see here like very different diets, different needs in terms of food. Maybe you don't like cooking together, and this can be something that's really disruptive in a relationship. An example that I go into detail about in the article, these are two people with whom I worked, and client 1, their Mars is in opposition with client 2's Ceres in Libra. And these 2 were involved in a really contentious 2-year custody battle. Client 2 moved the toddler son across state lines, while client 1 was at work one night. And so just left. And then this whole battle ensued, and it's still going on today with the way that they share custody and the way that they co-parent, different styles. And you can really see evidence of client 2's Mars being an influence. It's basically client 2 was in oppositional the entire time, even from day one. Client 1 felt like they could never could do things right. It turned out to be a pretty challenging, tumultuous relationship with their child. We also see the influence of Ceres in their composite chart. Look at that. It's right there conjunct Mercury, Pluto, Venus. It's right there in the very center of that stellium. And so, they had no problem getting pregnant. It was an unplanned pregnancy. So we can see fertility there, but we can see sort of the best and the most challenging aspects of that series. It's a big central point in their relationship, and it's a central point in their chart. We're going to move on to Vesta, and again, you can read more about these in the article. Themes Vesta represents. So Vesta represents dedication, sexual and spiritual intimacy. And I also think that Vesta is involved in sexual, like tantric practices, or the ability for a couple to take their spirituality or sexuality or sex life into a spiritual context. Vesta often shows a dedication to a cause, a feeling that the relationship is here to serve a bigger purpose. Vesta, also being the goddess of the home and hearth, relates to how well does a couple establish a home? Can they create sacred space together? Ritual is often something that's involved when Vesta's prominent. The couple works toward a common goal. And there's also balance in defining gender roles. And there's usually a private life that reflects itself with Vesta. Some of the challenges that we see when Vesta is in opposition, or if Vesta's got some challenging aspects, we can see sexual intimacy being, where celibacy might actually be a theme, or asexuality might appear at some point in the relationship. There can be a tendency, say, towards self-sacrifice on the part of one of the partners. We can see resisting starting a family or resisting marriage, having more of that non-traditional, like a spiritual bond that doesn't necessarily need form. We can also see difficulties with establishing a home base. And I see this with clients who have long distance relationships, for example. And it's very difficult to think of how are we going to come together and which one's going to move. And there can also be an element of secretiveness with the relationship. And an example that I liked for this one is the composite chart of Oprah Winfrey and Stedman. You can see that their composite Vesta is in Aries, and it is opposite their composite Saturn and Neptune in Libra. And Vesta is also in their composite 5th house, which is the house of children. And, these two have a non-traditional relationship, meaning they chose not to get married. And they also decided not to have children. And so we can see that reflected in the square between their composite Vesta and their moon in Capricorn. Service is a big part of their purpose together and their purpose individually. And so that becomes a real theme then in their relationship. And we also, so we can see some of that reflected in the symbolism of the sextile between their Vesta and the North Node. So they have shared goals and willing to make sacrifices, personal sacrifices for those goals. And then we also have Vesta in a trine aspect with their composite Pluto. And so that could help to explain some of their relationship is intimate, and it's also private, and they both keep it that way. They don't talk a whole lot about the intimate details of their relationship, even though Oprah has throughout her career talked about the intimate details of her life at certain points. So we can see Vesta playing a really prominent role in their relationship charts. Now we move on to Juno. Juno is an interesting one. I love Juno. I have Juno conjunct Sun. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about Juno and working with Juno. Juno represents loyalty, commitment. She's the goddess of marriage, but also related to legal contracts. Trust, soulmate relationships, these are themes we see with Juno. But on the other hand, the myth of Juno is complex. And it involves issues of jealousy and possessiveness and manipulation and infidelity. Also sexual repression. Juno had to wear a chastity belt. Juno, the myth of Juno shows some of that complexity. She was in the fullness of her power, coming to the relationship with that power, and then having to compromise in some ways as she and Jupiter moved forward. So we can sometimes see themes of codependence there too. But ultimately, when we see Juno relate in a significant way in the chart, we see a desire for equality in relationships and balance that often requires some shifting structures, and it often requires some work to get to that balance. I love the way that she expresses herself in the charts of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. We can see that their composite Juno is right there next to Venus. Look how close that is, and Mars. So she's going to play a big role in their relationships. And then we have it also in a square aspect to the midheaven. And if you think about their relationship, their loyalty to one another, their commitment to their marriage, despite all of the challenges that they've had with the royal family, with not being protected by the security, their loyalty toward one another has even set them at odds with the family, and in many ways with many in our culture. In an interview with Oprah, the famous interview with Oprah, Prince Harry spoke of their decision to step down from their positions as employees of the royal family, and he drew comparisons between Meghan and his mother. And so we see that reflected also in the trine aspect to Chiron. So this is a relationship that is here to heal through their loyalty and their bond. Then we move on to Pallas. And Pallas is, she's the goddess of wisdom and goddess of craft, like creativity and war. So she's got all of this complex symbolism. And I find that Pallas is involved in the relationship charts of people who really feel a commitment to be change agents in the world. Often there are creative collaborations that we find in relationship charts with Pallas very strongly represented. We see equality being a theme, manifestation. I just gave a talk at ESAR about lottery winning, and Pallas is really involved in the charts of people who have windfalls or who have successes. And Pallas really does represent our ability to materialize our goals, our dreams, our visions together. And often there's a shared financial goal when we see Pallas in relationship charts. On the other hand, there can be some gender role confusion, or like maybe you identify in one way, and then you enter a relationship and suddenly your sexual orientation or your gender identity starts to change, or even the way that you express gender and your gender roles in the relationship can change. And so we can see this sometimes too. And in challenging aspects, we can see like people who are unsupportive of each other's work. I love the way that Patti Smith and Robert Mapplethorpe's Pallas relationships are. They had a very creative, dynamic, and sexual chemistry. They had a creative, dynamic relationship with some sexual chemistry that even despite the fact that he, identified as gay, that aspect of their relationship was still really, really palpable. And in her book, Just Kids, Patti Smith writes of this and writes of the bond. And we can see the conjunction between his Pallas and her Mars, that being, an aspect of sexual passion. We can also see the way Patti Smith's son and his Pallas are conjunct. And so that being the creative experience of being together and being partnered. And so I really love the way that their charts exemplify the influence of Pallas. Real quickly, I'll also just touch on a few other asteroids that you might have fun working with. So Eros indicates romance and passion, and often this is one that lasts a long time. Sappho, I find it's really fun. It's like there's this like instant spark when we see Sappho represented in our relationship charts. And sometimes if it's in a synastry chart, you can see where one feels it and the other doesn't. And in composite charts, you can see where the relationship supports this. Cupido indicates attraction and romantic connections, and it's often like the energy of a crush. And so that can be something that doesn't have a lot of grounding. We need other influences to show whether or not that's gonna last. Amor shows love and romantic connection. It's more of a heart connection. It's like like the heart experience of love. It's like a shot from Cupid's arrow. And then Psyche also I like to work with. It's like a spiritual soul connection. And that's not just in romantic relationships. That can be in other relationships as well. So I encourage you to explore the asteroids, to work with them in your practice, and to bring them into your charts. And sometimes it's fun just when you're in a consulting space to ask questions. To sort of like back up your astrological research. If you see one of these asteroids really strongly represented, you can maybe ask what are some of the themes that are related to that asteroid and how do those play out in the relationship. And so that can help you to deepen your knowledge and your language and delineation ability working with asteroids. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing right now. I think my 20 minutes is up, so I will go ahead and open it up. I think go ahead. I'll turn it back.
Thank you so much. We learned so much about relationships from all four of you, because what is the first thing that somebody asks us when they come for a consult? I want to know about my love life, or I want to know about my relationship. I'm having a problem. Why are these things happening? And so the insights that all four of you have given are really, really key for all of us. We do have a question from Jennifer. Amanda, you've got this question. Did you want to go ahead and answer it for Jennifer?
Sure, and let me just refresh my memory. I'm wondering if let's see, where is it? I'm wondering if you may offer any astrological placements that might suggest or influence a person's preferences towards monogamy or not. And like I said in the chat, the short answer is no, because it's so much more complicated than that. And astrology is just describing like one layer of existence. We also have family of origin stuff and cultural stuff. And then the other thing is that, I do notice things coming into my session room a lot, like folks who have Uranus aspecting Venus, who are really trying to figure out how to make relationships work for them, or folks who are going through a Uranus transit. But I think that also has to do with the kind of clients that I attract and who is referred to me based on the fact that I have expertise in that area, more than like anybody with Uranus aspecting Venus is going to be more, have a tendency towards non-monogamous relationships. And so that's why there really is that, wanting to ask questions about things. I do notice, or I have noticed, that folks with Pluto in Libra, Pluto in Scorpio have been a lot more open to exploring it. And then as we're getting to Pluto and Sag folks, it's kind of just like a given. It's a lot more baseline normal for them to have, experience, familiarity with non-monogamous relationships. And so it was almost as if Pluto and Libra were initiating that being part of the norm, and being out about it, right? Because these things have existed for a really long time. But yeah, back to the summary answer is nope, no configurations show that.
Did anyone else want to add to that, and or maybe some insights on Jennifer's question? I think Jennifer's question is more on generalities as well. Can you make assumptions? I guess I'm going to paraphrase, Jennifer. If this is not correct, let me know. But can you make assumptions, or can you see within a chart whether somebody will have a tendency towards monogamy or a tendency not?
well, I'll chime in here.
Okay.
So sometimes it's interesting because I think some of the things that we might look at for that would show like non-traditional relationships, like Amanda was saying, Uranus. We think of the sign Aquarius as being outside the box in terms of relationships, but I find that they can go either way, to where you have like extreme monogamy or like non-monogamy. I'm thinking of one client I have in particular who has North Node in Aquarius, Mars in Aquarius, and exploring the question of non-monogamy in their marriage. That's something that's just come up, and I find that sometimes people who have who are like strictly one or strictly other, and who have Uranus or Aquarius in their relationship planet, reflected in their relationship planets, or in specific areas of their chart, that there can be a turn, that there can be like, I will never do this because it's, Aquarius in particular is a fixed sign. And so I see this a lot with like serial monogamy. And so you can see over time, sometimes by transit or progression, a shift into that. The other thing I'll say too is that I'm noticing that with some of my clients and young people who are in the Neptune in Aquarius generation, that their ideas of relationships and monogamy are so like, it's almost like there's a real openness to experience themselves first within relationships, and to honor their own experiences. And so I think we're going to see more and more of a cultural shift as these people come of age, and then later as the Neptune and Pisces eventually generation starts to come of age. I think that we can trace Neptune's generational influence and see the shifting dynamics of relationships really through that placement, in particular the ideals that we have around relationships.
Yeah, very good. You see, Jennifer, Rachel, it seems like extremes can then ricochet to the other end, and it sounds like society has moved away from binary to continuum in terms of gender identities, and thus into relationships. Yes, that was more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, and I think Amanda made a really good point, which is that we can't take things for granted anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So, it just as a practice, anytime I am talking to any one of my clients about relationships, I'm going to ask for pronouns. And even if I perceive that they're cisgender, heterosexual, I'm still going to bring that into the conversation, because I think we as astrologers are also, we're a part of the shift that's happening. And the way that we approach our client consultations, I think can help to open up our understanding of cultural norms. And ultimately, I think we're building more toward inclusivity, and we're going to see more and more of this as we move into Pluto and Aquarius.
Yes, now this is not a question in the chat, it's more from me, but in the past, relationship astrology has been synastry, and am I going to be good in this business, or my partner, or and mostly focusing on relationships, like personal relationships as well. I see that the whole relationship astrology is moving into a completely different realm, because it's no longer just about that relationship that I'm looking for, or whatever. It's all about what is actually happening in the chart that is being allowed to unfold. I listened to CBC a lot, which is like your NPR, but they had an interview with a family that the husband went through a transition, and 2 of the 3 children also are trans, and the other is gay and the mother is gay. So that whole family, it would be super interesting to look at those charts, how they interact and how they were drawn. You know, this is maybe a constellation thing, but I don't know. I just think that that's all about relationships. That's all about relating to yourself and your own identity as well. If I'm wrong, tell me. I'm okay with that.
Yeah, no, I think you raise a really interesting point, and it brings up something too that I feel, just as a lesbian and a queer person, is that one of the things that we want to avoid is pathologizing sexuality. You know, I once went to a Vedic astrologer who said, there's no way you're gay. And I'm like, actually, I think I know something about this subject. And he's like, I can see here, and this because of your Uranus, Mars, and da, da, da. And I think that I think what we want to, I think anytime we're working with clients or looking at charts, that we want to approach it with the experience of humans, like we're humans looking at other humans' charts. And so we can look for signatures of non-monogamy. We can look for signatures of gender. I mean, there are definitely things that you can see. And I would imagine that if we did look at those charts, that we would see certain things that, like, oh, this is an interesting way of it's really about self-reference.
Mm-hmm.
So how is this person self-referencing, and less about, like, who you are biologically and who you are in terms of your identity. And so I am of the opinion that I veer away from looking at sexual orientation in a chart, for example, just because I wouldn't want someone to put me into a box. Because I've had it happen and it doesn't feel good.
Oh, for sure. And I don't think I meant that. I think I meant more on how we relate to ourselves, how we, that whole expansion. Venus is no longer the goddess of, of whatever, that whole concept and the archetype that we think of Venus, or we think of Mars, those things are expanding and changing. They're no longer the statues that they are referencing. So I think we're going into a completely different area, and this would be absolutely fabulous for me, because those old concepts are just don't fit into what we see in the charts.
Yeah.
Is there any other comments or any questions? And I have to apologize for the late delay or the late mailing. There was kind of a little bit of a snafu. We got it out there. We had a few people on, and we hope that everybody enjoys this fabulous OPA Live. The talks were great. Thank you so much to everybody. And have a great day.
Thank you.